Hi there, I'm Kevin Gentry, and welcome to the Going Big podcast, where we'll explore some of the strategies that can help you transform your effectiveness by 10xing your fundraising. Each week, we'll sit down with some of the most influential business leaders, CEOs, and nonprofit visionaries to talk about leadership, the power of giving, and how you can make a real impact. If you want to make a transformational change to the cause you're working on, this is the place for that conversation. Also, take a look at our website, 10xstrategies.com. That's TENX strategies.com for lots of free marketing and fundraising resources. And be sure to sign up for the free weekly fundraising tips. Now, let's dive in. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm really pleased to welcome today as my guest a dear friend, Dario Paya from Santiago, Chile. Dario and I have known each other for more than 30 years, but I think his tale of the history of freedom and economic prosperity and growth in Chile up against those forces which often work against freedom has some very valuable lessons to us throughout the world, if not especially even in the United States today as well. Very similar to the conversation we had recently with Daniel DiMartino about his tragic tale of life in Venezuela. So Dario Paya, welcome.
Thank you, Kevin.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you for being here. The country of Chile, it's a sliver of land, the southernmost country in the world, closest to Antarctica, nearly 3,000 miles long, but barely 200 miles wide at its widest point on the Pacific Ocean. Tell us a little bit about some fun facts about Chile, and then I want to get into some of the recent modern history and its relevance to what we face today.
Fun facts. Well, maybe to put numbers you just threw out there in perspective. I don't know what the exact length in miles is, but I do know that if you put one end of Chile in London, the other end would be in Tehran. That's how much territory you cover. But then going east-west, it's at one point it's 90 kilometers. That's what, 60 miles or something? That's how narrow it gets. So basically, we are falling off the Andes Mountains into the Pacific Ocean. And a lot of people say that has a lot to do with our character of almost being what they call islander character, very welcoming to people who come from abroad. Basically, it's because we've developed through history with a huge, 1,000 mile or kilometer long desert in the north, the Andes on the east, and the Pacific Ocean in the west. Very hard to get to, as you've found out yourself coming our way several times in your life.
Well, some of the relevance is that it is the only Latin American country that has been designated as part of the economically developed countries. It is truly a highly developed economy. It has some challenges today, which we'll get into. But if you look at the world and you look at the prosperous countries of certainly parts of Western Europe, the United States and Canada, Japan and South Korea, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, Chile stands out, and also for a relatively small country. And a lot of it has to do with its history in the last 50 years or so. And you've been a part of that because you were born the same time I was in the 1960s. In 1970, Salvador Allende, an avowed Marxist, but running under the banner of the Socialist Party, won in a three-way contest for president. He won a plurality, not a majority, but he was chosen president and quickly established diplomatic relations within the Soviet Union, Communist Vietnam, Cuba. It was very much part of the sort of geopolitical contest of the day, but most importantly, he set upon to nationalize much of the industry in Chile, similar to what we've seen in Venezuela under Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro, and Cuba, other places. Tell us about Allende, and then tell us what you remember and then what happened as a result.
Oof. So you got time for 50 years of history?
Let's go for the first
Let me
5
no, but
years
let me
of
just mention something
1970,
about the recent
roughly.
past. Let me
We'll do
mention
like,
something.
yeah.
Let me mention something about the very recent past, because what you said is directionally true, but any Chilean would not recognize how we feel at the time right now uh, in our trajectory, which um, the country and the system that allow us to prosper and become what you described, um, a change here, a change here, a tax hike here, an extra regulation here, et cetera, to the point where for the last year, this country is barely growing. So the infrastructure, I would say, is there. The constitutional framework's still there, but you can have a good car, but when you go from bad driver to bad driver to bad driver, you can't expect for things to really move forward. So we are suffering from a lot of, at another degree, for certain, of the things that in extreme degree Venezuelans are suffering these days. So going back 50 years, I think it's impossible to look at that and have any sense of what it was like if we ignore that it was part of the Cold War. What was going on here was a chess move from Moscow through Cuba and the Castro regime, a beachhead in continental Latin America, while the revolution was spreading throughout the region. And that's why many of the things that Chileans had to suffer on both sides of the aisle in terms of violence, etc., in different shapes, mostly in much larger, to a much larger degree, in most cases, is what Argentina and Peru and many other countries went through. So that's the context. It's the Cold War. It's not just a reflection of internal disputes between this set of ideas on that or that. And the second thing, that to have a perspective on what Allende was trying to do in 1970 when he was elected, this was happening to a country that had been as socialist as any country could be, going back forever. It has to do with the history of the country. It was basically developed, it was first discovered, then conquered, and for hundreds of years, whatever was going on in Chile was dictated from Europe by the King of Spain. Okay. And then as an independent country, a lot of what was happening in this very long strip and narrow strip of land was being dictated by central government. So when Allende arrives, he's just like a consistent totalitarian socialistic vision to be imposed in a country that, to a large degree, had socialist institutions and was being run with those ideas as part of the mainstream. But they came into power with this notion of hope, poder total power. And of course, there were different visions between the extreme left in Chile, but many of the things that you saw, that you've seen repeated and you see happening the last 10 years in Venezuela happen here. You have to control people, so you have to control production, you nationalize industries, then what happens? A lack of production, then what happens? Inflation, then what happens? Price controls. And with price controls, what you have is, what's the English word? When you can't find a thing in a store, because production stops. So then you need to resort to actual, and this happens exactly the same way in Venezuela these days. In Chile, the left-wing government instigated what were called las JAP, Juntas de Abastecimiento Popular, popular local groups politically controlled by the left who were in charge of distributing food. What could possibly go wrong with freedom in those conditions? So I listened to DiMartino, and many of the things he was saying were like striking these deep chords of things I remember as a kid. And sorry for the long-winded explanation. Part of my generation's memories, I was 9, I was 6 when Allende took power, 9 when he was thrown out. One thing we would do, usually, I would go to school in the afternoons. My day started going to the store near my house to stand in line, just in case something came that would be of value. You would stand in line not knowing what you were going to buy, because you didn't know what was going to be available, but whatever came, you would want, because there was nothing. It sounds crazy. Hyperinflation, hundreds, thousands %. All people had was money, nothing to buy with it. It almost a perfect playbook of how to destroy a country on the way, this feverish vision of having total political control to install for good the new man created by the socialist revolution, Comrade Gentry.
Well, Dario, we've seen this play before, and we see how it turns out. It's remarkable over the past, 100 years, socialist governments which bring about centralized control, command and control the economy, does not know how, can allocate goods and services, and it leads to a spiraling down of the economy and ultimately economic deprivation. And then tied to that is the repression of any kind of political expression, because the government in power fears it will be turned out. Now, Chile had something happen differently. In 1973, there was a military coup which toppled the Allende government, and General Augusto Pinochet came in and for 18 years served as a military dictator. But during that period, something unusual happened, even though there was obviously an absence of elements of individual and political freedom to some degree. And you have obviously under military dictatorship, lots of bad things happen, as we know. But there was the story of the Chicago boys, the Chileans who had been educated at the University of Chicago under people like Professor Milton Friedman. They were back in Chile, and they were given the opportunity to help bring about dramatic economic reforms, which led to unparalleled growth for decades. Now, we'll comment in a moment about the challenges to that and what has happened against it. But that, in a way, is what brought about Chile from almost destitute place in the early 1970s to one of the most economically successful and prosperous countries, not only in Latin America, but in the world up until fairly recently. Is that a good characterization? Does that describe what happened?
It does. Chile went from being, if not the poorest, but at a certain point, how much poorer can you get? When being poor means you have no shoes. That's what the poor look like in my country. Half a block from my house was, my friends, half of my friends were that poor, no shoes. Okay, from being that poor to being at some point described as economic miracle. And my first comment is that there is no miracle involved. It's just freedom at work. So I used to have this conversation with my dad. He himself was a socialist. He voted for Allende. Then he was all for Allende getting thrown out and going up on his rooftop on the day of the coup, as most Chileans did, or many Chileans at least. Even in my neighborhood, which was left-leaning to say the least, going up on the roof to put the national flag as a sign of freedom. With my dad, who came to see the light, so to speak, he would tell me that when you spoke back in the 70s of a country going the way of free market economics and freedom, uh, the reaction, the cultural reaction, not just from the left, but no, that only works with Anglo-Saxon people. Okay. It's not supposed to work. So if you said, but look at America, well, there are this and that, and Protestant ethic coming to America. But what about the Germans? Well, the discipline. And what about Japan? And all the discipline again. So the idea that the same institutions, liberal democracy, free markets, individual freedom, rule of law, et cetera, could produce similar results was almost anathema to our culture, even on what you describe culturally as the right. That goes from the big picture to the small anecdote. As for instance, there's a famous political moment in Chile when the military, in conducting the economy, were getting rid of everything, all controls, among them price controls. So there's this famous, well-reported meeting when the producers of milk came to the authorities to discuss with the authorities what the price of milk should be, the price of milk should be, because it had been set free for the market to decide. And they said, well, we believe it should be 600 pesos or whatever. And the minister would say, well, go ahead and charge 600. No, but it should be 600. Well, go ahead and charge 600. The idea that you could charge whatever you wanted. No, even people who would be culturally inclined to support what we call now free markets didn't want free prices. They had a position in the market. They wanted protection from foreign milk. They wanted protection from any new producer of milk. It's the same old story of how do you say this in English? The stock trying to get government's help to stop the flow. The established from trying to keep competition from coming in. So it wasn't just about changing certain laws or creating certain institutions. It had to be a cultural change. And sorry if I'm jumping all over the calendar here, Kevin. To the Chilean radical left, what hurts the most is their ideological, doctrinarial, I don't know how to say that, defeat in Chile when they realized that in spite of all of the lies and things, Chilean culture changed. Chileans today appreciate and defend their freedom. And when the left went all in 3 years ago with a constitutional takeover, we can talk about later, the Chileans, by a huge margin, 65% said no, because it was a plan to get rid of many of the liberties that now have become part of our culture and life as we want it to be. So
thank you. Well, Dario, let me pause there because I do think it's worth noting that another particularly important point about the modern history of Chile is that because you had such long and sustained period of economic growth, and so many people were brought up from the lowest rungs of income and their situation to a much more prosperous situation, which brought about improvements in health, brought about improvements in education, et cetera. It's just an example of what can happen when you have economic freedom. And there aren't that many examples in the world, as you say, that can apply in the same way. But I want to get into it a little bit more in a different way now. So when you were in college, there had been, it was in 1988 was the plebiscite, essentially the referendum on Pinochet staying as dictator. Majority of the Chilean people said, no, it's time for somebody new. And that opened up elections, and Pinochet's term as dictator was over. but the economic prosperity continued, maybe not at the same rate, although for a while it was still at a very high clip. You were in college and you met somebody very important, and this is really central to this podcast today and the insights and lessons learned. And that is a gentleman by the name of Jaime Guzman. Jaime Guzman was a professor at the Catholic University where you attended, but also an extremely influential advisor. He effectively authored the Chilean Constitution that is still in practice today, was a very effective and important politician and political leader. Tell us a little bit about Jaime Guzman, and then I want to go into his role as a mentor. But first, how did you meet him, and how does that have a bearing in all of this?
Well, it's funny, but my wife asked me once, who is Jaime Guzman? Of course, she knew who he was. He was a major figure in Chile. When she asked me that question, I met Bettina, my wife, 2 years after Jaime had been assassinated by the left, and I assume we'll talk about that. So she was asking me, so what's Jaime to you? And I told her, look, if we end up marrying, which I was hoping would happen, and our family and my parents, Jaime is the single most important person in my life and will be, because of what I can only describe as an invitation to a project worth dedicating the best hours of your days and a significant piece of your life, if you could, which was transforming this country. Specifically, he was my teacher, first day of school, first class. Derecho Político, political law, was with him. And that same year, he was starting what would become a new political party on the right. It would grow to be the largest political party in the country in the 90s, UDI. And it was founded on September of '83. And it was a revolutionary concept, basically building up a political party built around the ideas of economic freedom and what you would describe generally in the United States as conservative social values, but with the support of the poor. The poor were supposed to be the left, and the poorer neighborhoods were physically controlled by the left. So he said, no, we believe in freedom and free market economics, capitalism, whatever you want to call it, not because it's good for the rich, it's what's best for the poor. So we're not even going to build a party thinking of the poor or for the poor. No, we're going to do it with the poor. It's our party. So it was quite a radical, revolutionary, ambitious project, and the reason he gave us was, for as long as it's only the left preaching Marxism and communist among the poor in Chile, the country's soul will be, ill, broken, divided. So we need to give people an alternative that they'll support as their own. So that was the invitation. Pretty exciting for someone, late teens or early 20s. And the same invitation was followed by thousands and thousands of people. This was a movement that started, and this is very interesting. It's a movement that Jaime started in university in the 60s. At a point of major interest for the left, which was to control the Catholic University of Chile, to break that wall of resistance, which was the Catholic Church, by taking over, among other things, university. He started a group in university. And again, in that group, 2 different campuses of the same university, with 2 different schools, were led by 2 gentlemen, Miguel Cast to anyone slightly familiar with the last name, with Chilean politics, the last name of Cast might ring a bell. Miguel was the older brother of current political leader in Chile called Jose Antonio Cast. So he led what you describe as the Chicago Boys, economics students who had learned and were trained and had a vision of how to transform the country economically, with a bunch of lawyers around the law school with Jaime Guzman as its leader on the institutional changes that the country needed to emerge as a powerful Western democracy. And those two thought currents came together in one project. That was Uri. That's the project he led. He led it so successfully. He was elected to the Senate representing the capital city of Santiago in the first election we had after Pinochet. The left never forgave him for it, and they assassinated him at the door of the very law school where I had met him 7 years earlier.
Well, Dario, let's go into that a little bit deeper. That's very profound. There's a lot of stuff going on in there.
Yeah.
First of all, as I understand what you're saying, is that there was an understanding strategically. Well, first of all, there was a philosophical, principled understanding of what you say about the sort of social traditions, the faith traditions of the Catholic Church, and also of the economic empowerment message, the individual empowerment message tied to free market capitalism. And it was sort of bringing that together into a political party, which is maybe could be paralleled to some things under Ronald Reagan or Barry Goldwater,
Yes.
or Margaret Thatcher, but is largely unparalleled at times like that in other parts of the world.
It is. Even to this day, the tendency for what you describe as conservatives and classical liberals, that split, that tendency is always there. Being able to articulate that in a common vision and a wider political movement, it's quite an accomplishment, political accomplishment.
Yeah, as you probably know, in the United States, it was really the understanding with Goldwater and Reagan, the fusionism that Frank Meyer talked about, and William F. Buckley, of bringing together social conservatives together with classical liberals, libertarians, while they would disagree in some areas, that there was a unified vision much more broadly if there was ever going to be political success. So the second point that I want to touch on this is another strategic insight that Jaime Guzman had, and that was, for so many political parties in Latin America, those that were associated with free market capitalism were tied to the wealthy and the population, and were never going to achieve political majority. But Jaime Guzman had an understanding. It's like, wait a minute, no, this message is for everyone. So unless we go to the poor, we will never be successful. And why not take this message of economic empowerment there? Why cede it to the left? Is that essentially what happened?
Yes, and you had to accomplish that territorially and culturally, as I mentioned before. And the country was split in thirds, and allegedly the right, which and was 1/3, which included people with more money, and then the radical left was another third, and that was supposed to be the very poor, and the less radical left was another third, and those were the middle classes, which really made no. I don't think it was ever true, but we don't need to go there. But that's what the numbers look like at the end of the day. The reality was that 2/3 of the country were expressively, in an express way, socialist in one or another shape, and a third maybe wasn't, which was where the rights was starting from. So, but yes, you had to go and find people who would lead from the neighborhood, It wasn't like going across the city on the weekends to say, "Oh, we're doing this, by the way. Would you like to vote for us?" No. And it was a story of most of the first generation of congressmen who were elected representing this new party that, like, I don't know if it's the same pattern in the US, but in Chile, cities are pretty split, segmented. How do you say that? Segregated economically. So you have a more affluent and a less affluent side of the city. Most people who were elected to Congress in 1990 and in 93, like my case, we were elected representing the less affluent part of the city. It was the case for Jaime Guzman himself. He was elected senator representing the less affluent half of Santiago, which came to the total shock and confusion, not just of the left, but even of the right, which culturally many people, even the right, probably believed that the left was supposed to represent the poor. I don't know if that makes any sense. Um, so it goes to show how deep the penetration of left-wing thought is, or was. The class vision of the Marxist left had penetrated as a very smart worm into the brains of even those who would never profess Marxism. So doing that require a very deliberate effort. And, I hesitate to use the word because of being involved in any way, shape, or form with that effort, though my part was small. It was a very courageous effort on behalf of Jaime on every front. In fact, he paid the ultimate price, but he was not the first member of UDI who was assassinated by the left. The person, Simón Yemenes, who led the organization of people on the poorer areas of the city, he had been assassinated 5 years earlier by the Communist Party. By the way, with guns and support and organization all coming from Cuba, the same guys behind what's going on in Venezuela today. Whenever any of these guys had to flee the country because the police were after them, they ended up in a tropical beach in Cuba. That's where many of them can be found to this day. This was all part of a larger picture that, to some extent, still persists in Venezuela today. But that's not what you were asking. So
well, no,
I'll finish with this. Yes, go ahead.
So just to put a fine point on this, strategically, Jaime Guzman understood that in order for this effort to be successful, you just truly had to take this message to everyone. And the remarkable discovery, for example, was that it took a lot of work, but to take this message to the poor had the reward of the poor understanding the message of economic empowerment and embracing it, to the point that your political party, UDI, became the biggest political party. You ultimately were elected to Congress, as you said, in a similar form. You served 4 four-year terms before you were chosen to be the ambassador to the Organization of American States in Washington. But just to finish up this particular point, and then I want to really highlight the mentorship piece, which is where we go big. And all of this is going big. I mean, Jaime Guzman, who was assassinated while he was in his 40s, had big ideas, a big, big vision. We're still talking about this now. This is extraordinary. This has international consequences for the way he was thinking about things. But another key to it was that he also believed in leadership identification and training. He would identify, as you say, people like you who were in student government in the university, go to you directly, recruit you into this work, and ultimately you and your generation became the next generation of political leadership for this political party. Tell us a little bit about that. I know that has influenced about how you've thought about your own life, your professional life, what you're doing today. But how does what he was doing have a bearing on how we should think about going big?
Yes. Well, for once, the vision was as big as it gets, transforming a country. And that is always as big as it gets. But imagine being told that when you're 18, 19, 20, being led by people who were 24, 25. On the technical side, on the agencies setting up the new economical institutions, you would see a lot of people who were 23, 24, 25, who were in charge of big things. And a tradition we carry to this day, which are these meetings with a sandwich on a Friday where we discuss policy. When I was 19, 20, I was listening to kids who were 24, 25, who were in charge of implementing these things on the government level. So on every aspect, being invited to assume responsibilities and huge ones, it's super powerful. And then, of course, Jaime led with example. He never said, Dario, I would like you to join, do this and that. It didn't take too much for me to be overwhelmed by this feeling of seeing someone committed to the last gram of humanity, of his humanity, to a cause. And I was just offering opinions. So, it's just overpowering. You feel, how can I help? And he was super methodical when he came to the need to identify committed people and who believed in the importance of those ideas for the country and for the future of the country, and to invite them to be part of this and learn whatever it was we needed to learn to make this movement grow. So I think inevitably, at least if I look at what it meant for me, even why and how we met, and pretty much what I've spent the best part of my life. And by best, I mean not just the largest, the best, which is in one way or another on that avenue of trying to identify good people and helping them become better leaders to serve the ideas we share.
So, Dario,
Yes.
just to bring this even to a head further, but to close out this earlier chapter, you were a teaching aide to Jaime Guzman. He was teaching still at the Catholic University while he was serving in the Chilean
Yes.
Senate.
Oh, yeah.
And
Yeah,
again,
he would
was
never
this
stop teaching. Yes.
Okay, so he was this extraordinarily important and influential political force, but also he was serving at the Catholic University, continuing to teach. But as you said, the left never forgave him for successfully taking his message of empowerment to the poor, essentially going on their turf. If you would, tell us what happened. I'm sure our audience is
Okay.
eager to understand this, but does not know. There's no reason that they would really know this story.
I can share with you. It's a very of how and why, what triggered his actual assassination. Briefly before that, how could I not be persuaded that training people, educating them was important? As he was running for the Senate, while being a candidate for a 5 million people city, he would meet with a group of young leaders of this new movement. It was about 18, 20 of us, twice a week from 6:30 to 8 p.m., prime time for politics, as part of a course going deeper into the institutions and the nuts and bolts of economic freedom and all that. While running for the Senate, he felt this was more important than being out there shaking the extra hand. So no surprise that many of us would walk away from that example, knowing that training people to become better how do you say, people committed to those ideas, why that is so important. So Jaime's assassination came not as a surprise. The particular event has to do with a reform that was proposed by the left and supported by some elements on the right, giving the presidency the power to pardon convicted terrorists. Under the Chilean constitution, the president had the power to pardon common criminals, but not terrorists. And the idea was presented of a constitutional reform. And obviously we were going to vote against it. It's when the decision, no, it's not the decision of what to vote. When the political committee of the party, what you would call that, there was a discussion as to who wanted to talk on the day of the vote. It was a joint session of the Senate and House. And Jaime said, look, I'm the only one here who's single. So I'm the one who's going to talk. You all have families to worry about. So I'll deliver the explanation of the vote on behalf of everyone. To this day, you can see his video. It's remembered every year of him saying, voto no, I vote no. And he was killed a week after that, within 2 weeks of that. So he stared the consequences of what he was doing straight in the eye and decided to go forward. So I think that explains a lot of the lives of many, many people who were at the time part of that project, and also many others who were not fully into it, but at that moment decided, oh, that's what I've been avoiding all these years. I wish I hadn't. And they went full into continuing and taking that project further.
All right, so that's the
I
segue.
frankly, I don't even remember what the question was, Kevin.
No, that's perfect. And so that's the segue into how you've chosen to go big over a long period of time, first in Chile and now more broadly in Latin America, to focus on the kind of leadership identification and training that perhaps you learned firsthand from Jaime Guzman. And then perhaps, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you were inspired by him to devote your life to this. Tell us what you're doing today and why that has important consequences for the future of all of us who share these principles with you in terms of economic empowerment, individual freedom, everything that motivates us to be involved in the public policy process.
Well, I decided in 2010, I had been in Congress for 16 years already, that I was no longer needed there. That party had grown, and now we had plenty of people who wanted to be candidates. I had always worked identifying and training and promoting younger people, so I thought it was fitting for me to promote someone younger to run for my seat. But as I always say, I was in politics. I was involved in politics for 10 years before I was elected to Congress. So it's very weird to me when people ask me, why did you leave politics? Leaving Congress wasn't leaving politics at all. So one thing that started back when Jaime was alive, I was looking at his behest for a model for training our younger generations and leaders in general. And in looking for that, I came across a graduate of the Leadership Institute in the United States. He explained to me what it was. And we invited Morton Blackwell to come to Chile for a training seminar that I was in charge of putting together. and translating for Morton and other people like Grover Norquist, who were part of that program. This coincided to the week with Jaime's assassination. We had to postpone the program, the training program, a month because it was supposed to happen the same week that Jaime was killed. So that mission was given to me in the late 80s, and that's how I came across the Leadership Institute and why we started the Chilean version of the Leadership Institute, adapted to our political and cultural reality. And we train thousands of people every year. And these days we're, what we do had certain very innovative and audacious element of training, and this got the attention of some people. So we started getting over the years people from Peru and Argentina and Colombia and Venezuelans and other countries to come to our programs in Chile and asking, could you please help us? Can you bring this program to our country? And so that's part of what we're doing now systematically, is to have our training be available in Peru and Argentina. We just had a 2-day training seminar in Buenos Aires 2 weeks ago. I was in Colombia a few months ago. So it's taking what we learned from the Leadership Institute in the United States and the adaptations to our political culture, offering that on a regional basis. And in doing so, and please stop me, Kevin, because I could talk forever. In developing this international connection, certain pattern emerge. Very dramatic and dangerous events have happened in Chile in the last 5 years, and we have a perfectly rational domestic explanation for it. But then you realize that in Peru, with just a few months of difference in the calendar, they had a similar thing happen in Ecuador, in Colombia, and Panama, and you go, wait a second, there's a pattern here that we can discuss. So there's a playbook that the radical left uses to this day. I think this particular playbook has its origins in Venezuela, in Chavez, and what they're undergoing now. But so recently, with someone you may know or not, called Kevin Gentry, and we had this conversation. We need to make evident to more people who have a concern for the institutions of freedom and who understand how important it is for freedom to expand in the region, for the region to prosper. We need them to be aware of this and do our job in better promoting our own ideas, in better supporting the ideals and institutions of freedom for that playbook not to succeed. Because if you look even superficially to Latin American politics, you will see how deep and powerful the grasp that left-wing ideology has in our institutions and culture to a large degree.
Well, I have two final wrap-up questions for you, Dario. The first is, and this came up in the conversation in our previous podcast with Daniel DiMartino about Venezuela. For the course of history, for thousands of years, life was, in the words of Thomas Hobbes, nasty, brutish, and short. It was pretty miserable until we had so many of the ideas related to America's founding, by the founding fathers, about self-government and liberty, and then, of course, how that took hold in so many other places. And over that period of time, we've had a conflict over those ideas, whether it should be a kind of a bottom-up empowerment, freedom-based society, or a top-down government control, and in these cases, socialist, authoritarian command and control approaches. And as you say, we've seen it over and over and over again that the socialist and command and control approach fails, and it fails the people, and it impoverishes them, and it makes their life worse. But as you say, they keep trying this playbook over and over. So what you're saying is what you saw in Chile as a child, and then the remarkable turnaround of what embracing freedom meant for the people of Chile. And you could also look at a country like Argentina, which before World War II was one of the most prosperous countries in the world. And then, of course, it was also virtually impoverished by the same kind of socialist approach. Venezuela, one of the most prosperous countries in the Americas until Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro took it into this death spiral. There's a pattern here. You've spent some time in the United States. Do you think we're at risk as well in the United States?
Well, because of the way power is distributed in your country, it's probably harder. So what is that playbook for you to judge? The playbook that the left learned by the experience of Hugo Chavez was that he won. He was very popular, and within months, he pushed forth and got a significant majority in a constitutional convention to have all the powers that would allow him to progressively control every institution, to trigger that irreversible move to North Korea, which is what Venezuelan institutions are these days. So if for those who somewhat follow Latin American politics, what happened in Nicaragua over 35, 40 years to become another nightmare as it is today, when you have a constitutional convention, you can get that overnight. So to do the revolution, comrade, you no longer need to grab some old M16s left over in Cuba from, the Vietnam War and go up into the Sierras and start the guerrilla coming down the mountains to take over. No, all you needed was to get a constitutional convention and a majority, and overnight you could have it all. And that's what the left has been organizing and doing. And that's what you saw exactly in Chile, in Peru, in Ecuador, in Colombia, in Panama, within a couple of years. Rioting like it had never seen before, the levels of violence, something that defies common sense if you are supposed to believe that it's all spontaneous and organized. But anyhow, where the violence came from, let's ignore the discussion. What emerged from those episodes of violence was always the same demand: a constitutional convention. In Chile, they got it. And fortunately, they went so far past anything that was reasonable that the document they presented to the country for a plebiscite was rejected by 2/3 of the country. So we were this close. We were this close. That's the playbook these days. So,
well, that was the point that Daniel DiMartino made as well in the previous podcast, that for example, if in the American elections progressives were to sweep, which is a possibility, it's not a likelihood, but it's a possibility, they would be able to then, in the filibuster, pack the U.S. Supreme Court, add a couple of states, increase their political power, all legally. But they would use the political power then to enhance their political power and then begin to undermine things like free speech, change election laws, things like that. And they've talked about that openly on the campaign trail to inspire their grassroots supporters. But it is amazing that playbook exists all over the world. Well, let's leave on a high note. Your last one, give us some hope, because obviously you've got to be hopeful if you've dedicated your life to this leadership identification and training, continuing the legacy of Jaime Guzman by trying to identify aspiring leaders and empower them to carry forward on these shared principles, especially when we're no longer around to continue to carry that mantle. Leave us on a high note.
Well, I'll do my best, but I'll just point out to what to me is obvious. The direction is clear, and what it takes is leadership. Look at Argentina. I mean, the level, the depth, and amount of talent in that country is just incredible. What's being keeping Argentina like underwater almost. It's political class, and what it needed is a very, very, very powerful leader to be able to confront all that and emerge with the support of the people to do very radical and sometimes painful reforms. I've spoken to people in Argentina who didn't vote for him, who wish it wasn't happening, but end up telling me, but we hope it works out because we really need something else. Peru, people look at Peru and they hear all these stories about their institutions, how they have all these complications. They visit Peru and see this vibrant society. How is this happening? There's like a lot going on if you go to Lima. Well, half of it is happening outside the reality of the state. It's informality. Is that the word you use to describe that? All those old institutions are not able to contain. Now, if they reform their institutions, Peru would be a rocket ship. They need leadership for those reforms. And in Chile, after 30 years of the left repeating every line in the book about what freedom meant to Chile, the institutional infrastructure is there. Our culture has changed to incorporate the instincts of free society, most of them. So we're waiting for better leadership for this country to have another go at what the people need. So the direction is clear. It just needs leaders who think big and do big things.
Dario Paya, thank you for joining us today. It's always a pleasure to be with you. I hope that you continue to do all of your good work for a long time, and I look forward to our continued partnership. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for what you do, Kevin. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to today's Going Big podcast. Hopefully you were inspired to go big for your cause. Remember, this is all about transforming your effectiveness by 10xing your fundraising. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to subscribe or leave us a review at iTunes, Spotify, iHeartRadio, or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also catch this episode on YouTube. And also, there are lots of resources available to you at my website, which is 10xstrategies.com. That's TENXstrategies.com. You can sign up also for our free weekly fundraising tips. This is all about helping you get to the root causes of some of the biggest problems in society today by transforming your fundraising and your effectiveness. Thanks again. We'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.